Thanks very much, Alan. I presume that's evidence, but of what I'm not absolutely sure. I must say it was a joy to sit here during the last session to watch the three regulators under the spotlight. We have the added privilege of being able to comment on those three regulators regularly. And in the consumer policy inquiry which I headed up, it was a particular insight into the way in which regulators operate. I was just speaking to a couple of people during the break that it's interesting that the Productivity Commission has a very large work agenda around improving the nation's regulation. But there's been almost no work done on best practice as regulators. And it may be a work that is well due in Australia over time. At the moment, I think I'm in my 11th inquiry. I'm currently on executive remuneration, the not-for-profit sector, and gambling. And the only three things, the only way that I can pull that together is to say I think the business sector has formed the view that we're trying to turn them into not-for-profits, and the gambling sector are taking bets on it. And as three draft reports have all come out in the last few weeks, I must say I'm more than battle-scarred, but we shall continue. But in the consumer policy space, I think there's been four significant inquiries that directly deal with consumer policy issues. Just about every other one of them deals with it indirectly. They were and are the two gambling inquiries in 1999 and the current one that's underway. It was the Consumer Product Safety Inquiry, which I headed in 2006, and of course it was the Consumer Policy Inquiry, which I also headed in 2007 and 2008. And it's interesting that today we talk about evidence. I'd hope that the long history that the Productivity Commission has had as the Tariff Board, the Industry Assistance Commission, the Industry Commission, and now the Productivity Commission was always based on some evidence. But I am always reminded of this important fact, that the starting point always matters. But what also matters is that evidence may change that perspective. So when we face the consumer policy inquiry, you could enter it from a consumer rights basis. You could take the very well-documented Consumer International rights that have been established for consumers and say that's the entry point. You could in fact say that some aspects of it, particularly in relation to consumer product safety, should come from the public health arena and apply those principles. Or as many of our staff in the Productivity Commission, which has a couple of hundred staff in Canberra and Melbourne, most of whom are economists, but I'm not, would say we look at the way in which the market is functioning. We look at whether the prices are in fact signalling the right incentives and whether the market itself is performing. But in a sense, evidence transcends that. Evidence says, well, whichever part you want to start from, what does the actual evidence tell you? I just referred to, Alan was talking about light bulbs. There are two light bulb jokes. One is how many economists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is none, because if it needed changing, the market would have fixed it. And the other is about community welfare advocates, of one which I've been, is how many of those does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is none, but it takes 12 to write a paper on living in darkness. And in a sense, they are two conundrums. The economist ever waits for the market to respond, and the advocate ignores the problem altogether and finds another way of dealing with the issue. But what does the evidence tell us, or where does it come from? The Commission's whole raison d'etre is about collecting evidence. It's about doing that through a number of processes: submissions, private discussions, open consultations, forums, public hearings, draft reports, and then you go through the whole process again. So unlike the regulators, we don't suffer the problem of transparency. It's all out there. You know what we're thinking in the draft, and you no doubt know exactly how to criticise it in the lead up to the final. But the question is, what is evidence? Well, evidence comes from many sources. It is the study of existing regulations and their impacts. It is the evidence about how consumers actually behave. And both the consumer product safety and the consumer policy inquiries, I hope, demonstrated that the Commission does have a capacity, albeit imperfect, and albeit a bit of a struggle sometimes, to actually look at the evidence. And here I want to pay a compliment to this sector. There is no question in my mind and that of my colleagues that in the consumer policy inquiry, the financial credit advocates were well ahead of the field in predicting what is likely to occur with the global financial crisis than just about anybody else. Of all the groups we've ever spoken to, there is no doubt that the consumer groups understood better than anyone else including the regulators, what the potential could be. It's not to say that they predicted either the size or the exact scale or the exact nature of that crisis. But from their interaction with consumers both here and overseas, and a careful listening to what was happening, they were able to put forward propositions. But I would also say there were very few people willing to listen. And there were very few people to believe that a consumer advocacy group could in fact be more knowledgeable than the financial sector. History proved that to be incorrect, but a credit to those from that sector. It is about empirical evidence. It's about trying to find the numbers that support the arguments. And that's hard in the consumer policy space. But it's absolutely essential if you're going to, in fact, advocate substantial regulatory responses to some of these problems. It is about trying to look at the consumer data. And I was particularly interested in your discussion about the results from Ombudsman's office. During that inquiry, we spoke to the Banking Ombudsman, the Telecommunications Ombudsman, we spoke to many energy and water, electricity ombudsmen and others. And it was very clear that there was in fact a failure to be able to translate those complaints into systemic responses. One of the great failures in Ombudsman's office is to misunderstand and underrate the need to in fact collate and articulate that information in a way that gives a systemic response. Equally, it is a problem with regulators and policymakers that they undervalue what that particular information is telling them. And they do so because they look at the individual, often who's vulnerable or at risk, and in fact discount the information because of the clients or the consumers. That is a fatally flawed approach, because those consumers do in fact have a story to tell, and the collection of complaints tells us a bigger and different story to that of the individuals. That information also comes from theories, from different backgrounds and different areas. I started by saying where you enter these policy discussions matter. It does. But being open to in fact looking at both economic and other theories is absolutely essential. And if you are coming to this debate, these policy areas from a particular perspective, you have to be open to explore other theories from other disciplines. In the Commission, we struggle with that from time to time. It is largely an organisation that sees the world through the economic lens. But public policy is not economic policy. Public policy is in fact the integration of economic, social, cultural aspects. It is that which brings it together. Public policy is not from one stream, it comes from several. But a second question is, who do you listen to? And this is one of the great challenges for advocates. The mere fact that you may have evidence of quality doesn't necessarily mean you'll have a ready audience. One of the great challenges of a consumer advocacy, but more generally for everybody, is to work out how they can in fact ensure that their voice is heard. Those of you that have been around good policy making, rare though it might be, would understand that you can have the best policy under the sun, but it won't necessarily be sufficient to get it up. And that's an issue even in inquiries. And so who do you listen to? Well, a couple of things that are very important. Firstly, people in the Commission and others are absolutely very attracted to well-researched, peer-reviewed academic information, particularly that which is based on empirical information. It's naturally predisposed to look at that information in its initial literature reviews. Secondly, it does look to actually see what's happening and what are the numbers, not only in relation to complaints, but in relation, for example, to consumer detriment. In the Consumer Product Safety Inquiry, there is a complete paucity of good quality data about the impacts of unsafe products in Australia. We spoke to coronial officers and all researchers that were active in this area, but it was incomplete. My point about that, however, is whatever the information is, it should be gathered and used very effectively.